Well, isn't this charming? Nell, dear, did your father take this one?
No, Mrs. Caldwell. I did.
You did? How enterprising.
It's not even straight.
Honestly, Nell, this is exactly why we brought in someone with proper training. Perfectly nice for family keepsakers, perhaps. But they're certainly not professional.
Would you be willing to have any of these published?
Published where?
I own a magazine called The Western Record.
Picture a young woman holding up a photograph she took with her dead father's camera, and picture the richest woman in town laughing so hard at it that the sound carries clear across the room. Now picture, standing in the doorway behind them both, a man in a plain traveling coat who has not laughed, who has not spoken, and who happens to own 3 of the largest newspapers west of the Mississippi. What that man does next will change everything for the girl with the camera. But none of that happens until Nell Ashby learns, in front of half the town, exactly what the people of Copper Bend, Montana think her photographs are worth. Before we go any further, if stories about quiet people doing extraordinary things are the kind that speak to you, take a moment to subscribe. Most of our listeners found this channel by accident, and subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss the next one. It costs nothing, and it helps this small channel more than you'd think. Nell Ashby had inherited exactly 3 things from her father when he died: a wooden box camera with a cracked lens hood, a leather case full of glass plate negatives she did not yet know how to develop properly, and the lease on a narrow storefront on the south end of Copper Bend's Main Street that had served, for the last 11 years of Edmund Ashby's life, as the town's only photography studio. Edmund had been a quiet man who saw the world in frames, in the rectangle of light that fell through his studio window each morning, in the way a mother's hand rested on a child's shoulder during a portrait sitting, in the particular quality of late afternoon sun on the mountains west of town that he had spent years trying to capture on glass, and never quite felt he had gotten right. He had not been a wealthy man. Photography on the frontier was a trade that sustained a life but rarely enriched one, and Edmund had never seemed to mind the distinction. He had come to Montana from Ohio as a young man, following the promise of open space and better light, and had built his studio board by board over the course of a decade, turning a leaking storefront into a place where the people of Copper Bend came to mark the moments of their lives they considered worth preserving. He photographed weddings and funerals and newborns and grandparents, and the occasional traveling dignitary who passed through town and wanted a portrait to send back east, and he treated every sitting with the same quiet seriousness, regardless of whether the subject could afford his full rate or needed to pay in eggs and firewood, which happened more often than most of his customers would have admitted. The studio earned enough to keep the lease paid and the chemicals stocked, but not much beyond that. And when a winter fever took him 3 days before Christmas, Nell found herself, at 22, the owner of a business she had watched her father run her entire life, but had never been formally taught to manage. She had learned by proximity, the way children of craftsmen often do, standing beside him in the darkroom from the time she was tall enough to reach the developing trays, watching him coat plates and time exposures, and adjust the big wooden camera on its tripod with the patient, unhurried precision of a man who believed that every photograph deserved his full attention, regardless of whether the subject was a senator or a shopkeeper's daughter. She had taken her first photograph at 14, a portrait of Mrs. Henley's cat that had come out slightly blurred, but which Mrs. Henley had nonetheless paid $1 for and hung above her mantelpiece. And Edmund had told her afterward, with the quiet pride he reserved for genuine accomplishments, that she had a good eye, and that a good eye was worth more than a steady hand, because a hand could be trained, but an eye was something a person either had or didn't. After his death, Nell kept the studio open, She had no other income and no family left to fall back on. Her mother had died when Nell was 6, and Edmund had been an only child with no living relatives anyone knew of. She taught herself, through trial and error and Edmund's carefully kept notebooks, how to prepare collodion plates, how to manage exposure times in different light, and how to operate the studio's old printing press well enough to produce cartes de visite that were, if not quite up to her father's standard, at least competent enough that the families of Copper Bend continued to come in for portraits when the occasion demanded it. Weddings, christenings, the annual school photograph, the small ceremonies that marked the turning points of ordinary lives. The first months had been the hardest. Customers who had trusted Edmund with their family portraits were not immediately certain they could trust his 22-year-old daughter with the same responsibility. And Nell had lost several regular clients in the weeks after his death, not to any particular dissatisfaction with her work, but to the vague, unspoken discomfort that some people felt about being photographed by a young woman, rather than the experienced older man they were accustomed to. She had won most of them back, one sitting at a time, through the simple strategy of doing good work and not complaining about the ones who chose to wait and see. And by spring, she had built the client list back to roughly where it had been when Edmund was alive, though the margins remained thin, and there was never quite enough left over at the end of each month to feel secure. She was good at it, not yet as good as Edmund had been, but good enough that people noticed, and better, with each passing month, in ways that she herself could see when she compared her recent work to the prints she had made in the weeks just after his death. She had inherited Edmund's eye, if not yet his technique, and her portraits had a quality, a directness, a willingness to let the subject's face tell its own story, rather than arranging it into someone else's idea of how a portrait ought to look, that several of her customers had remarked upon, though none of them used the word artistry, because artistry was not a word that occurred easily to people in a small Montana cattle town when they were talking about a 22-year-old girl with ink-stained fingers and a cracked camera. The trouble, when it came, did not arrive in the form Nell had expected. She had braced herself for the slow decline of a business losing its founder, for customers drifting away, for the lease becoming harder to pay, for the quiet erosion that follows any small enterprise when the person who built it is no longer there. What she had not braced herself for was Dorothea Caldwell. Dorothea was the wife of Copper Bend's mayor, Franklin Caldwell, a man of middling political talent and considerable inherited land, whose chief accomplishment in office had been the construction of a new town hall that had cost roughly twice what the town could comfortably afford, and had been furnished, by a remarkable coincidence, by a lumber company in which Dorothea's brother held a controlling interest. Dorothea herself was a woman of strong opinions, expensive taste, and the particular social confidence that comes from never having been told, in any conversation that mattered, that she was wrong about anything. She had decided, that spring, that Copper Bend needed a proper photographer for the town's upcoming Founders' Day celebration, a formal event involving speeches, a parade, and a commemorative photograph of the town council that would be printed in the regional newspaper and, Dorothea hoped, reflect well on both the town and its mayor's wife. She had also decided, without consulting Nell or anyone else who might have offered a different perspective, that Nell Ashby was not that photographer. The reasoning, as Dorothea explained it at a meeting of the Founders' Day Planning Committee, held, naturally, in the parlor of the Caldwell house, was straightforward. Nell was young, untrained in any formal sense, and her work, while adequate for family portraits and school pictures, was not of the quality one would want representing Copper Bend to the outside world. The committee, which consisted of Dorothea, 2 women who agreed with everything Dorothea said, and the wife of the town's only lawyer, who agreed with everything Dorothea said but more quietly, and a rancher's wife, named Mrs. Clement, who had once told Nell privately that she thought her portraits were lovely, but who did not. When the moment came to say so in front of Dorothea, find the words or the will to do it, voted unanimously to award the Founders' Day photography contract to a Mr. Harrison Webb, a studio photographer from Helena, who had been recommended to Dorothea by her sister-in-law, and whose quoted fee was nearly 4 times what Nell would have charged for the same work. The fee alone would have been enough to keep Nell's studio supplied with chemicals and glass plates for the better part of a year, and losing it to an outsider, not because her work had been evaluated and found wanting, but because it had never been evaluated at all, stung in a way that went deeper than the money. It felt, though she would not have put it in these words, like being told that she did not exist in the town where she had lived her entire life, that her father's 11 years of work had left no mark worth acknowledging. Nell learned about the decision the way she learned about most things in Copper Bend, secondhand, from Mrs. Rafferty at the general store, who mentioned it with the careful, apologetic tone of a woman who knew she was delivering bad news and wished someone else had gotten to it first. "I'm sorry, Nell," Mrs. Rafferty said, weighing out flour with more attention than the task strictly required. "I know it isn't fair, but you know how Dorothea is once she's made up her mind about something." Nell did know. Everyone in Copper Bend knew how Dorothea was. The difference was that most people had decided, long ago, that knowing was sufficient, and that acting on what they knew was someone else's responsibility, a calculation that had allowed Dorothea to operate more or less unchecked for the better part of a decade. Mrs. Rafferty herself was not immune to this. She sympathized with Nell genuinely, but she also bought her flour from a supplier connected to the Caldwell family, and there were limits, in a small town, to how far sympathy could carry a person before self-interest pulled them back. She thanked Mrs. Rafferty and walked back to the studio and sat for a while in the chair her father used to sit in, beside the window he used to frame his afternoon shots through, and allowed herself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel the particular sting of being told that the work she had poured herself into for the past year was not good enough. Not by someone who had examined it carefully, not by someone who understood what went into coating a plate or timing an exposure, or waiting for the light to do what light does only when it is ready, but by a committee of women who had never once set foot in her darkroom, and whose sole qualification for judging her work was being married to men with more money than she had. And then she stood up, because there were appointments that afternoon, and plates to coat, and no one else who was going to do any of it. What happened next was Dorothea's doing entirely, though Dorothea would later insist she had meant nothing by it. The Founders' Day exhibition was held in the town hall, a public event to which the entire town was invited, featuring Mr. Webb's formal photographs of the council, alongside a small display of local crafts and goods. Nell attended because she was part of the town, and because staying away would have looked like sulking, which she refused to do, and she brought with her, at Mrs. Rafferty's quiet suggestion, a small portfolio of her own recent work. A dozen prints she was genuinely proud of, landscapes mostly, the mountain light her father had spent years chasing, and that she had, in the past few months, begun to capture in ways that surprised even herself. She set them up on a side table near the entrance, alongside the quilts and carved wooden toys that other townspeople had contributed, and stood nearby, not drawing attention to them but not hiding from them either. Dorothea noticed them within minutes. Dorothea noticed everything within minutes. She crossed the room with the deliberate, unhurried walk of a woman who has identified something worth commenting on, her daughter-in-law and 2 committee members trailing behind her like a small, well-dressed convoy, and stopped in front of Nell's prints. She picked one up, a landscape Nell had taken at dawn, the valley floor still in shadow, while the peaks above caught the first light, and held it at arm's length, turning it this way and that, as though examining it for flaws the way one might examine a piece of questionable meat at the butcher's. "Well," she said, in a voice pitched to carry well beyond the small group around her. "Isn't this charming? Nell, dear, did your father take this one?" "No, Mrs. Caldwell," Nell said, keeping her voice level. "I did." Dorothea's eyebrows rose in an expression of exaggerated surprise that fooled no one. "You did? How enterprising." She set the print down and picked up another, a portrait of old Mr. Hawkins, the blacksmith, his face lit by forge light, his hands still holding a hammer. And this time she laughed outright, a bright, carrying laugh that drew the attention of nearly everyone in the room. "It's not even straight," she announced to no one in particular, and everyone within earshot simultaneously. "You can see the horizon tilting, and the lighting. Honestly, Nell, I don't mean to be unkind, but this is exactly why the committee felt it was best to bring in someone with proper training. These are perfectly nice for, what, family keepsakes? But they're certainly not." She paused, selecting her word with the care of someone who wants to sound reasonable while being devastating. "Professional." The room did not quite go silent, but it got close. Mr. Hawkins, the blacksmith whose portrait was among the prints Dorothea had just dismissed, shifted uncomfortably near the back wall and seemed, for a moment, on the verge of saying something in Nell's defense. But the moment passed, as such moments tend to in rooms where the person doing the talking has more social power than the person being talked about, and Hawkins settled for folding his arms and staring at the floor with the particular intensity of a man who is angry with himself for not being braver. Several people looked away. A few looked at Nell with the helpless sympathy of people who disagree with what is happening, but are not willing to publicly disagree with the mayor's wife. Nell felt the heat in her face, and the tightness in her chest, and the very strong desire to say several things she would not be able to unsay. She did not say them. She picked up the print Dorothea had set down, straightened it carefully, and placed it back in the portfolio without a word, because there was nothing to say that would change Dorothea Caldwell's mind, and because she had spent enough of her life as Edmund Ashby's daughter to understand that dignity, once surrendered in a public argument, was considerably harder to recover than a lost contract. Her father had taught her that too, though not in words. He had taught it by the way he handled the occasional customer who questioned his prices or complained about a likeness, responding always with the same quiet, unshakable courtesy that made the complainer, rather than Edmund, the one who ended up looking small, and nothing to gain from trying in front of a room full of people who had already decided, by their silence, which side of this particular conversation they were willing to stand on. I wonder how many of you listening right now have known someone like Nell, someone whose work was dismissed by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see what was actually there. A parent, a friend, maybe even yourself. If you have, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Those stories deserve to be told just as much as this one. What Nell did not see, as she gathered her portfolio and walked toward the door with her back very straight and her eyes very bright, was the man standing just inside the entrance who had watched the entire exchange without moving. His name was Solomon Hale. He had arrived in Copper Bend 2 days earlier, on business, unrelated to photography, or to Nell Ashby, or to Dorothea Caldwell. He was surveying potential locations for a new telegraph relay station. One of several dozen such errands he performed each year across the Western Territories in connection with a communications and publishing enterprise that bore his name on its masthead, but which he rarely discussed in person, preferring to travel simply and observe quietly, rather than announce himself and watch people begin performing for his benefit. He had learned, early in his career, that wealth announced was wealth wasted, that the moment a man in a small town learned he was speaking to someone important, the conversation stopped being honest and started being strategic, and honesty, in Solomon's experience, was the only currency that held its value reliably across every town he visited. Solomon Hale owned the Hale Publishing Company, which operated 3 daily newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and St. Louis, along with a weekly illustrated magazine called The Western Record that had, over the past 5 years, become one of the most widely read periodicals west of Chicago. He employed 14 staff photographers across his various publications and had spent enough time looking at photographs, both excellent and mediocre, to know the difference between the two within a few seconds of examination. He had glanced at Nell's prints on the side table as he entered the town hall, expecting nothing in particular, and had stopped. The landscape, the one Dorothea had dismissed as charming, was, in Solomon's experienced judgment, significantly better than charming. The composition was intuitive rather than trained, which gave it a rawness that formal instruction would likely have polished away, and the light was handled with a sensitivity that reminded him, uncomfortably, of work he had paid considerably more than a small-town studio rate to acquire for the pages of the Western Record. The portrait of the blacksmith was, if anything, better. It was not perfectly straight. Dorothea had been technically correct about that. But the quality of attention in it, the way the forge light carved the old man's face into something that felt earned rather than arranged, was the kind of thing Solomon's editors spent weeks looking for and rarely found. He said nothing at the exhibition. He was not a man who acted on impulse, and he had learned, over many years of business, that the value of patience almost always exceeded the value of speed when a situation involved someone else's pride. Instead, over the following days, he made quiet inquiries. He learned, from the man at the livery stable who boarded his horse, that Nell Ashby was Edmund Ashby's daughter and the town's only photographer. He learned, from Mrs. Rafferty at the general store, that the Founder's Day contract had been taken from Nell and given to an outside photographer at Dorothea Caldwell's insistence, and that Mrs. Rafferty considered this a considerable injustice, though she had not felt it was her place to say so publicly. He learned, from the hotel keeper who seemed happy to talk about anything that might keep a paying guest in conversation, that Mayor Caldwell's administration had developed a pattern of directing public contracts toward businesses connected to the Caldwell family, and that the photography contract was merely the most recent and most visible example. He visited Nell's studio on his third afternoon in town, presenting himself simply as a traveler interested in having a portrait made. Nell welcomed him with the professional courtesy she extended to every customer, the same unhurried greeting, the same offer to hang his coat, the same careful attention to positioning him in the light that would serve his features best. She did not rush. She did not make small talk while she worked, which Solomon noted with quiet approval, because photographers who talked while they composed were, in his experience, paying attention to the wrong thing. Sat him in the chair beside the north-facing window her father had always preferred for its even, steady light, and took his photograph with the same careful attention she gave every sitting, adjusting the camera twice, waiting for the light to settle, and making the exposure with a quiet confidence that told Solomon everything he needed to know about her competence, that Dorothea Caldwell's commentary had failed to convey. While the plate was developing, he asked casually whether she had any recent work he might look at, landscapes perhaps, or anything beyond standard portraits. Nell hesitated. The memory of Dorothea holding her prints at arm's length and laughing was still fresh enough to make the act of showing her work to a stranger feel like a risk she was not entirely certain she wanted to take again so soon. But something in the man's manner, the quiet attentiveness with which he had sat for his own portrait, the way he looked at the studio itself, as though reading its history from the arrangement of the equipment and the prints on the walls, told her this was not a man who had come to judge her the way Dorothea had. She brought out the portfolio Dorothea had dismissed at the exhibition, setting it on the counter with the particular care of someone who has recently been given reason to handle their own work, as though it might be criticized at any moment. Solomon looked through every print, slowly, without speaking. When he finished, he closed the portfolio and asked Nell a single question. "Would you be willing to have any of these published?" Nell stared at him. Published where? I own a magazine called The Western Record, Solomon said, in the same plain tone he used for most conversations. We run a photography section in every issue. The landscape with the valley and the morning light, I'd like to run it as a full page. And the blacksmith portrait, if you'd allow it. I'd pay you the same rate I pay my staff photographers, which is considerably more than whatever the Founders' Day committee was offering. Nell did not answer immediately. She looked at the portfolio, then at Solomon, then back at the portfolio, as though checking that both were still real, and that she had not somehow misheard a sentence that contained the words published, full page, and pay in the same breath. You're serious, she said. I am rarely anything else, Solomon replied. Your father taught you well, Miss Ashby. These photographs deserve better than a side table at a town hall exhibition. Solomon did not stop at the photographs. In his remaining days in Copper Bend, he made one additional inquiry, into the Founders' Day photography contract specifically, and into the pattern of contract awards Mrs. Rafferty and the hotel keeper had both alluded to. What he found, through a few carefully worded letters to the county clerk's office and a brief conversation with the editor of the regional newspaper in Helena, confirmed what he had suspected. The contract awarded to Harrison Webb had been arranged without any competitive process, at a fee well above the market rate, through a recommendation that traced directly back to Dorothea Caldwell's brother-in-law's business connections in Helena. It was not, strictly speaking, illegal. It was, in Solomon's considered opinion, precisely the kind of arrangement that thrived in small towns, where no one had the means or the inclination to look too closely at how public money was being spent. Solomon also made a quiet visit to Harrison Webb's studio in Helena, under the pretense of inquiring about rates for a corporate portrait series, and confirmed what the pricing discrepancy had already suggested, that Webb was a competent but unremarkable studio photographer whose work, while technically sound, showed none of the instinctive eye for light and composition that Nell's best prints demonstrated. The contract had not been awarded on merit. It had been awarded on connection, and the distinction, to a man who had spent his career identifying and cultivating genuine talent, was not a small one. Solomon wrote a letter to the editor of the Helena newspaper, a man he had known for years and whose independence he trusted, laying out the contract discrepancy in factual, unemotional terms, and suggesting it might be worth a paragraph or two in the next edition's coverage of municipal spending across the territory. He did not mention Nell by name. He did not need to. The facts spoke clearly enough on their own. The following month, two things happened in quick succession that changed the course of Nell Ashby's life in Copper Bend. The first was the publication, in the Western Record, of Nell's valley landscape as a full-page photograph in the magazine's monthly feature on the American frontier, credited to N. Ashby, Copper Bend, Montana. Solomon's editor in Denver had written a brief accompanying note describing the photographer as a self-taught young woman carrying on her late father's studio in a small cattle town. Solomon's editor had placed the photograph opposite the magazine's lead editorial, the most prominent position in the issue, and the print quality, far superior to anything Nell's own press could have produced, revealed details in the image she herself had not fully appreciated until she saw them reproduced at full scale. The precise gradation of shadow in the valley floor, the way the morning light caught individual trees on the ridgeline like small bright fires against the dark timber. It was, she realized, looking at her own work through a stranger's press for the first time, better than she had allowed herself to believe it was. The response from the magazine's readership was immediate and, to Nell, entirely overwhelming. 3 letters arrived at the studio within 2 weeks, 2 from other photographers expressing admiration, and 1 from a gallery owner in San Francisco asking whether Miss Ashby had additional work available for exhibition. The second was a short article in the Helena newspaper reporting that the Copper Bend Town Council had awarded its Founders Day photography contract at a rate significantly above market value to a photographer with a business connection to the mayor's wife's family, without soliciting any competing bids, including from the town's own resident photographer. The article was factual, restrained, and devastating in the particular way that factual, restrained reporting tends to be when the facts themselves are embarrassing enough. Mayor Caldwell issued no public response, though it was generally understood in Copper Bend that the conversation between him and Dorothea on the evening the article appeared had been audible from the street outside their house. The Founders Day Committee was quietly dissolved the following week, and the contract with Harrison Webb was allowed to expire without renewal. The article's publication had a secondary effect that neither Solomon nor Nell had anticipated. It prompted two other Copper Bend business owners, the livery stable operator and the man who ran the town's small freight service, to come forward, separately and without coordination, with their own accounts of contracts that had been steered toward Caldwell-connected businesses over the previous several years. Neither man had felt comfortable raising the issue before, but the Helena newspaper's coverage had, as one of them put it, made it considerably easier to say out loud what everyone had been thinking privately for a long time. The county clerk's office opened a review of municipal contracting practices in Copper Bend shortly afterward, a process that would continue, quietly and methodically, for the better part of the following year. Dorothea Caldwell did not apologize to Nell, not directly, and Nell did not expect her to. But Dorothea was noticeably less visible at public events in the months that followed, and considerably less inclined to offer unsolicited opinions about the quality of other people's work, which the women of Copper Bend regarded, privately, as a marked improvement in the town's social atmosphere. Nell's studio did not become famous overnight. That was not how things worked in a small Montana town in the 1880s. And Nell would not have wanted it to work that way even if it could have. What did happen was quieter and, she thought, more lasting. New customers began arriving from towns she had never heard of, drawn by the magazine feature, and the quality of the work she was asked to do expanded beyond family portraits into the kind of documentary photography her father had always dreamed of doing, but had never quite found the market for. Within 6 months of the magazine feature, Nell had saved enough to replace her father's cracked lens hood and purchase a second, newer camera that allowed her to work faster without sacrificing the care Edmund had taught her to bring to every exposure. She hired a local boy, the Rafferty's youngest son, to help with the developing and printing work that had begun to exceed what one person could manage alone, and she taught him the same way Edmund had taught her, by standing beside him at the trays and letting him learn through proximity and repetition rather than instruction, because some things, she had come to believe, were better absorbed through the hands than through the ears. She photographed ranches and mines and the faces of people whose lives had never been considered worth recording before, and she did it with the same careful, unhurried attention Edmund had taught her, because a photograph, he had always said, was nothing more and nothing less than proof that someone had been paying attention. She kept, pinned to the wall above her developing trays, the first letter she had received from the San Francisco gallery, not because of what it said, though what it said was generous, but because it had been addressed to N. Ashby, photographer, and those two words together, her name and her profession, were the first time anyone other than her father had acknowledged that the two belonged in the same sentence. Beside it, on a small shelf Edmund had built for his own keepsakes years before, she kept the glass plate negative of the valley landscape, the one Dorothea had called charming, the one Solomon had put on a full page, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the distance between being dismissed and being seen was sometimes nothing more than the width of one person's attention, arriving at exactly the right moment. Solomon Hale continued to pass through Copper Bend from time to time, always on legitimate business, always traveling simply, and always stopping by the studio to see what Nell had been working on since his last visit. He published her photographs in the Western Record 3 more times over the following year, each time paying her the full staff rate without negotiation, and each time running her name in the credit line without abbreviation. Because names, he told her once, were the one thing a person built that outlasted everything else they made. Whether the people of Copper Bend ever fully understood who the quiet traveler in the plain coat had been, or how much his brief visit had changed the fortunes of the young woman whose photographs they had once dismissed as charming, neither Solomon nor Nell ever felt any particular need to explain. The studio's hand-painted sign still read Ashby's, the same as it had when Edmund was alive, and Nell saw no reason to change it. The name had been good enough for her father, and it was good enough for her, and the work that came through the door now, more of it and better paid than Edmund had ever managed, was proof enough that a name, like a photograph, gained its value not from who approved of it, but from the care that had gone into earning it. Some things, Nell had come to believe, were best understood the same way a good photograph was best understood, not by being told what you were looking at, but by looking long enough to see it for yourself. That's where we'll leave Nell Ashby, her camera in her hands and her father's eye behind every frame, and the quiet stranger who saw what the whole town had missed, and decided, without raising his voice, to make sure the rest of the world saw it too. If you were listening to this story while doing something else today, maybe with a cup of coffee, or out on the porch as the evening light comes in, or working with your hands the way Nell did, every single day, I'd love to know about it. Tell me in the comments what kept you company while this story kept you company. And if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to know what part of the world you're joining us from today. These stories have traveled further than I ever imagined, and hearing where you're listening from always means more than you'd think. If stories about quiet strength, about people whose work speaks louder than the people who tried to silence it, are the kind that stay with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if today's story was worth your time, a like helps this small channel more than you might expect. Thank you, truly, for riding along with me today. Until the next trail.